This is a picture drawn by a pair of sisters about Mr. Cruel, a frightening man, and behind it is a very lengthy case. Initially, upon hearing the name Mr. Cruel, I thought it might be a creepypasta character or something similar. But upon further investigation I learned that this is not the case. Mr. Cruel is a real person who has committed horrifying crimes that have shaken the entire country of Australia. The story begins in 1987 in the suburbs of Melbourne, where Mr. Cruel committed his first crime through a meticulously planned break-in and sexual assault. The issue was that he had planned everything thoroughly, leaving no trace at the crime scene that the police could link to the perpetrator. Nearly 45 years have passed and many people describe him as a shadow. The reason he is called Mr. Cruel is because a journalist described his first crime as super cool and super cruel. Incredibly cold-blooded and extremely cruel. So the name Mr. Cruel was coined. Now let's delve deeper into the story. At 4 a.m. on August 22, 1987, in the quiet suburb of Lower Plenty, Melbourne, Australia, a man wearing a mask covering his entire head and face stealthily invaded a sleeping household. He delicately removed a window pane on the ground floor, effortlessly gaining access to the interior. Subsequently, he ascended to the upper floor, heading straight to the bedroom of the couple. Armed with a gun and a knife, he posed a challenge that woke them up, telling them to stay calm because he only intended to take some money and a few valuable items from the family. If they obediently followed his instructions, no harm would come to anyone. The couple dared not resist, as their house was not only by them. In the adjacent room, their 2 children were sound asleep, a 6-year-old son and an 11-year-old daughter. He then proceeded to tie the couple with a type of knot commonly used by sailors, or at the very least, those with seafaring experience. Finally, he pushed them into the wardrobe and locked the door. However, he was not an ordinary thief. His purpose for breaking into their home was not money. The 6-year-old son awoke upon hearing strange noises and was immediately blindfolded and tied to his bed. In reality, he had been observing this family for some time, and his primary objective was the 11-year-old daughter. Mr. Cruel stayed in the girl's room for 2 hours and committed a horrifying act. After satisfying his perverse desires, he went down to the kitchen and prepared himself breakfast. Strangely, before leaving he took an audio cassette box and a high-necked green woolen sweater belonging to the homeowner. The family had requested to keep their identity concealed in the media. This case left the entire Australian population shocked, because in the 1980s, Melbourne was considered an ideal place to live and raise children, due to its low crime rate. The 11-year-old girl mentioned that during the time he was in her room, he used the family's phone to call someone, and the content of the call seemed like a threat, roughly stating that your child will be next. However, when the police investigated the call history, no data was stored, and rapid investigations were carried out, but the police couldn't find any leads connecting them to the perpetrator. They even suspected they were dealing with someone who knew the police's moves in advance. His audacity and calmness made the police fear that his crimes were far from over. However, for several months, no similar incidents occurred. The police somewhat relaxed their guard, unaware that Mr. Cruel was silently preparing for the next plan. On December 27, 1988, Mr. Cruel returned, choosing a family in another suburban area of Melbourne at 5:45 a.m. On that morning, while John Wills was asleep, he felt a cold, metallic object against his head, and a man's voice instructed him not to resist. Mr. Cruel, still wearing the mask, broke into John's house through a window. And everything he did next was exactly like the previous case. He tied the couple and said he was only there for some money. He then circled the house, cutting all the phone lines, and finally headed straight to the children's room. In the room, there were 4 children, including a 10-year-old girl named Sharon, who was Mr. Cruel's targeted victim. He even knew Sharon's name. Later, the police said that John's family might have become a target because they had recently been in the news due to a house fire. The couple quickly untied themselves within 15 minutes and rushed to the children's room, realizing that Sharon was missing. John quickly called the police but discovered that the entire phone line of the family had been cut. He rushed to the neighbor's house, banging on the door until they woke up and helped him. The police arrived and searched the entire area, but there was no trace of Sharon. It was so agonizing that John and his wife thought Sharon might have been killed. The search continued for 18 hours until a woman walking along the road at midnight happened to see a green plastic bag with an unusual shape on the roadside. Inside was Sharon, still alive but having suffered injuries similar to the first victim. However, Sharon was still cheerful, and what she later told the police was even stranger. Sharon mentioned that the assailant had worn a mask the entire time, so she didn't see his face and couldn't identify him. However, she described Mr. Cruel as quite gentle and kind. He even spoke to her very softly. He even made a sandwich and a glass of lemonade for the girl when she said she was hungry. Just before letting her go, Mr. Cruel cleaned up, brushed Sharon's teeth, cut her nails, and neatly combed her hair. According to the police, these actions were not out of kindness, but to eliminate all of his DNA from Sharon's body. Although the girl returned home safely, Mr. Cruel left a lasting fear for the entire John Wills family. They couldn't sleep well for many months and had to get a dog to guard the house. However, once again, investigations led to a dead end. Sharon only remembered one thing during her abduction. She always heard the sound of airplanes flying overhead. Mr. Cruel kept silent for the next 2 years, until July 3, 1990, this time in another quiet suburb of Melbourne called Canterbury. The difference was that Canterbury was a residential area with many politicians and famous Australians living there, so security was very strict. Mr. Cruel targeted the Linus family, who were well-off British expatriates. They came to Australia for work and planned to return to England in a few weeks. On that day, July 3, 1990, the Linus couple, Brian and Rosemary, attended a party, leaving their 2 daughters home alone. Just before midnight, Fiona, 15, and Nicola, 13, were awakened by the screams of a man. He carried a gun and a knife, forcing the 2 girls to comply with his orders. While Mr. Cruel was tying up Fiona, he instructed her younger sister Nicola to put on a school uniform. He told Fiona to relay a message to their parents, prepare $25,000 for Nicola's ransom. Eventually, he placed Nicola in Brian's car and drove away. Just over 20 minutes later, Brian and Rosemary returned home. The first thing they noticed was their stolen car and the front door wide open. Upon going upstairs, they discovered their elder daughter Fiona tightly bound to the bed. Fiona had conveyed Mr. Cruel's threat to her parents, but strangely, he didn't leave any information regarding the location or the transaction method. Nicola was kidnapped for approximately 50 hours and endured similar pain to the previous victims. Afterward, Mr. Cruel blindfolded Nicola, wrapped her in a thin blanket, and left her by the side of the road not far from her home. He demanded that she only remove the blindfold after he had left. Nicola's statements about Mr. Cruel were similar to Sharon's. She mentioned that he was always gentle with her. Nicola tried to observe Mr. Cruel through the blindfold, and recognized that he had reddish-brown hair and was over 1.7 meters tall. The mask he wore was black with white stitching around the eyes and mouth. When Nicola was brought to Mr. Cruel's residence, she heard him speaking loudly with someone else. However, she didn't hear the other person's response, leading the police to suspect the involvement of an accomplice. Eventually, they thought it might be a deception tactic by Mr. Cruel. Many months after returning, Nicola regained her composure and remembered hearing the sound of an airplane while at Mr. Cruel's house. This testimony aligned with Sharon's account. Afterward, investigators suspected that he lived in the vicinity of Tullamarine Airport. However, ultimately, they lacked sufficient evidence to investigate and apprehend anyone. His crimes did not cease, and this is the final and most heinous crime of Mr. Cruel. On April 13, 1991, Mr. Cruel broke into the home of John and Phyllis Chan. This wealthy family owned 3 restaurants and rental properties throughout Australia. That night, the couple entrusted their eldest daughter, 13-year-old Carmine, to look after their 2 younger children at home. It seems Mr. Cruel knew this in advance, with investigators believing he might have been monitoring his victims weekly or even monthly to learn their travel habits. Around 8:40 p.m., Carmine and her 2 younger siblings entered the kitchen to prepare food when they discovered a man standing in the kitchen, wielding a knife. Mr. Cruel. He wore a fully covering mask and a grayish-blue tracksuit, demanding, "I just want money." This was the same lie he had used with all his previous victims. He instructed Carmine to lead him to where the money was kept. But before she could respond, he forced the 2 younger sisters into a wardrobe, pulled a bed in front to block their escape, and finally took Carmine away. A few minutes later, the 2 younger sisters called their parents, and the police arrived at the scene, but investigations proved no more successful than in the previous cases. The police found a spray-painted message on Phyllis Chan's car right after the kidnapping. Its content roughly suggested that this couple is the head of an illegal smuggling ring. However, upon investigating the Chans, the police realized this was just another misleading tactic by Mr. Cruel. Following this, the Chan children drew a picture that you saw at the beginning of the video, as they had come face to face with the perpetrator. Initially, people believed that Mr. Cruel would release his victims safely, as he had done in previous instances. But as 70 hours passed without any sign, they began to fear. The Chan family published an encoded letter in the local newspaper, using a code that Carmen Chan could decipher. They also offered a hefty ransom, up to $300,000, for the safe return of their daughter. The search for Carmen Chan became one of the largest manhunts in Australian history, known as Operation Spectrum. It consumed millions of dollars and over 10,000 hours of police and volunteer efforts. Sadly, Carmen Chan never reunited with her family. Nearly a year after the specific abduction on April 9, 1992, in Thomastown, about 20 kilometers from Carmine's home, a man walking his dog accidentally discovered a fully decomposed set of bones. These remains were later identified as those of Carmen Chan. The body had likely been there for almost 12 months, not long after Carmen Chan was abducted. Several theories suggest that during resistance, she might have seen Mr. Cruel's face or learned his whereabouts, leading to her demise. Operation Spectrum continued for several years to unveil the identity of Mr. Cruel. Over 27,000 suspects, 10,000 statements from citizens, and more than 30 houses were searched, yet the police returned empty-handed. Operation Spectrum was permanently shelved in 1994, and the case went cold. However, in 2022, a criminal told the police that he knew the real identity of Mr. Cruel, and it wasn't an ordinary man. According to this informant, Mr. Cruel is a notorious criminal named Norman Leung Lee. Indeed, Norman Leung Lee's residence shared many similarities with the descriptions victims provided of Mr. Cruel's house. However, it was not enough to reopen and investigate the case. Nearly 40 years have passed and no one has been able to determine the true identity of Mr. Cruel. He may still be lurking somewhere, enjoying freedom outside the reach of the law without facing any consequences for his crimes. And this is Creep Factor. Thank you for taking the time to watch the entire video, and if you like this video, please click like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more interesting contents.